How many of you would be willing to begrudgingly grant that you look a little bit like your parents? And anybody willing to give it up? I've seen your dad, so you got to give it up. Anybody who's willing to grant that you look a little bit like your folks? I'm sure if they were here, it would be quite evident from my point of view. The point, very simply, is that you come into the world with a set of genetically acquired characteristics that establish the foundation of the kind of self that you can become. And one way of thinking about it is that the self establishes boundaries, both in terms of limitations and opportunities of the kind of person that you might be. All right, to be silly for a moment, does it make sense that I'm not a great candidate for biological motherhood, right? I'm not going to have kids. Who does sports? Any sports people? I'm not going to be a center for a professional basketball team, being somewhat vertically challenged. This may be a little old. Who knows Stevie Wonder, the great musician? He's not going to be a great air traffic controller or diamond cutter, being as he lacks the visual acuity that would render him able in that regard. The point, very simply, is that you get dealt by biology and genetics a particular kind of physical carcass that ultimately, in some cases, limits the kind of person that you might become. In other cases, though, it renders you more able to flourish in certain respects. So who's ever heard the term perfect pitch in music, right? Those are annoying people that you play a sound, right? And they tell you exactly what note that is. Well, it turns out that perfect pitch is a genetically acquired characteristic. And I hope it makes obvious sense that people that are lucky enough to be born with it are a lot more likely to become accomplished musicians than people like myself who after 20 years are still unable to tune a guitar and suffer the consequences accordingly. Or rather, the people that have to listen to me suffer the consequences accordingly. All right, point is, and actually Freud said this, biology is destiny. You come into the world with a biological foundation that really determines the kind of person that you might become. Who's ever read about or heard studies of identical twins that are separated at birth and reared in different parts of the planet, and how sometimes they're just amazing, the commonalities that we find? And does it make sense that to the extent that you have people that are identical genetically, but they're reared in different parts of Earth, that any similarities must be due to genetics or heredity? And we now know that a lot of things, not just your physical body, have a genetic component. So how intelligent you are, whatever intelligence is in part genetically determined. Whether or not you'll become schizophrenic is in part genetically determined. The propensity for manic depression, who's heard of bipolar disorder, in part genetically determined. In fact, we know from the studies of Amish people in Pennsylvania the exact gene on which the propensity for manic depression resides. Certain kinds of alcoholism are in part genetically determined. A couple more that I think are pretty interesting that we didn't know until a couple of years ago. Sexual orientation, the extent to which someone is either heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual, is in part genetically determined. How about this one? Religiosity. Who knows some people that are devoutly religious, other people maybe not so much? In part genetically determined. Couple more that astonish me. Political orientation. Who knows people that don't necessarily share your political views? You ever been in a room with somebody and they're saying, oh, I believe this, this, and this, and you're like, holy crap, we don't even live on the same planet. How could you possibly believe that? Well, it turns out that give those other poor folks a break. They can't help it. It's in part genetic. Believe it or not, your political orientation, and this one is a little asymmetrical because it turns out that conservative political beliefs are much more likely to be genetically acquired than folks that lean in a more moderate and liberal direction. They just can't help it. That's the way they are. All right, two other characteristics, and then let's move on. One's what's called introversion, extroversion. Who's familiar with those terms? Introversion, people are just kind of quiet, keep to themselves, and very happily so. Anybody know those kinds of people? What about extroverted individuals? Outgoing, gregarious, love to be around other folks. All right, who knows those kinds of people? All right, in part, genetically determined. One more and then we'll move on so as not to belabor the point. And this is a thing called temperament. Temperament, very simply, is defined as the propensity to experience anxiety. So who knows people that are just relatively composed, even under the most adverse of circumstances? Anybody know people that are just pretty mellow? All right, then who knows my relatives? People that are completely perfused with overwhelming anxiety, just twitching piles of biological protoplasm, cowering under their desks, just groping for Valiums the size of Buicks. You know my people? All right, so the point is, though, is that where you stand on that spectrum, from incredibly mellow to profoundly prone to massive bouts of overwhelming anxiety, in part genetically determined. All right, what's the point? The point is very simply that part of the self that you now are is a function of biological factors way above and beyond your control.